This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Flare, a leader in providing actionable cyber threat intelligence to companies and governments around the world.
Chris Johnson is the founder, president, and CEO of China Strategies Group, the leading consulting firm on understanding China and how to deal with it. Chris, who has been on our show many times and who worked for CIA for years as a leading analyst on China, joins us today to catch us up on all things China since we took our sabbatical earlier this year. We'll be right back with that discussion with Chris after a quick break. I'm Michael Morrell, and this is Intelligence Matters. The lines between geopolitical risk and cyber risk are blurring. Flare is a next-generation, continuous threat exposure management SaaS platform that equips corporate information security teams with world-class collection and continuous monitoring across dark web cybercrime forums, markets, Telegram channels, and sources of geopolitical risk. Flare sets up in 30 minutes, creates actionable intelligence from hour one, and is used by governments, security teams, and threat intelligence teams around the world. You can try Flare's free trial at their website, flare.io. That's flare.io. Chris, welcome back to Intelligence Matters. It has been way too long.
No problem. My pleasure to be here.
So, Chris, I have to tell you, when I announced that Intelligence Matters was returning, I received a handful of emails asking me when you were going to be on. So you have a lot of fans out there on Intelligence Matters, and a lot of people, very interested in your views on, what remains, right, the key issue of our time, despite what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East. So
thanks. Great
to have you back on. I also wanted to let everybody know that you just got back from China. So it'd be a great opportunity to get some on-the-ground views. So really, really a pleasure to have you. And let's kind of get right to it. Let's start, if it's okay with you, with the U.S.-China relationship. And it seems to me there's a couple of kind of contradictory macro trends going on, right? One is that both sides seem to, I don't know, you tell us, but both sides seem to want to dampen the tension a little bit, right? And there's been a number of meetings, right, at the cabinet level. There's a meeting coming up between President Biden and President Xi. I think it's going to happen pretty much when this podcast drops. So it hasn't happened yet. There's been new fora set up to talk about economics, even some defense discussions. So a lot going on, right, in the kind of dampen tensions category.
Yes.
But in the other category, right, nothing seems to have changed in the underlying structure of the relationship that, is responsible for all this tension.
Right.
The behavior by the Chinese on all sorts of issues and, the U.S. response to that, right, on all sorts of issues. So we just love your kind of framing of where we are in the relationship today.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a great question, Michael, and it is wonderful to be back. Thank you. I'm always happy to be on the podcast. And I think your tee up there really captures it pretty well, which is to sort of say, I guess in my judgment, that the relationship is sort of a strange, I don't know what we call it, maybe witch's brew at this moment, in which both sides, for their own reasons, are indeed looking to sort of tactically stabilize the relationship, but neither is willing to climb out of what we might call their respective foxholes to take the steps necessary, right, to address the more fundamental structural tensions in the relationship that could help put it on a more stable footing over a longer period of time. And so to elaborate a bit on each one of those elements from my perspective, I think you're right that there's been a lot of bilateral communication over the last several months, especially when viewed against, the backdrop of virtually no high-level engagement for most of the last 3 to 5 years. And, it seems to me that both sides, and particularly the Biden administration, seem to have been sticking, at least publicly, to the line, something akin to sort of, talking is better than not talking. And although that is objectively true, of course, it is helpful. My sense is the mantra is going to perhaps quickly run out of gas, right? If the two presidents meet at APEC and the meeting is sort of what the kids would call meh. and and importantly, there are no obvious deliverables, right? And especially what we might call stakes in the freezer for U.S. business. Then I think we'll begin to see a lot more criticism potentially of the Biden administration's approach, especially from Republicans in Congress, and as we descend into our own version of the political silly season, with the presidential election cycle starting off in earnest really from this week, I guess we could say. And in fact, I think we already have, for example, Congressman Gallagher, right, from the China Commission on the Hill in Congress, referring to these sort of bilateral interactions, these discussions as what he termed zombie engagement in an op-ed in June. And I think that line from him didn't gain a lot of traction when he first introduced it in June, but my sense is it could come roaring back, if we don't see substantive progress coming out of the Biden-Xi meeting. And yet, as I mentioned, both sides seem reluctant also to lean in, I guess we could call it, to say nothing of making proper concessions, as you suggested, to set the relationship on a course of longer-term equilibrium. And I think this is best captured in what my contacts in both governments have been saying over the last couple of weeks about preparations for the Biden-Xi interaction at APEC that you just mentioned. For example, the few deliverables that are even being discussed seem to me to be pretty small ball and yet proving exceptionally painful, right, to get traction on. So that includes getting the Chinese to do more on the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And I mean that, of course, in the sense of what might be on the table coming out of the meeting. The U.S. is pushing the Chinese side, of course, to make progress on better controlling the supply of fentanyl precursors. But the Chinese are making clear, that wouldn't be possible unless the administration is willing to remove these sanctions, right, it had placed on a Chinese police forensics lab that the administration says it may have been involved in some human rights abuses in the troubled ethnic minority region of Xinjiang in China. And similarly, the Chinese are saying they're willing to clarify, the restrictions that they put in place around U.S. semiconductor firm Micron in terms of restricting their ability to sell in China, but only in exchange for some concessions on broad U.S. export controls, right, which Secretary Raimondo from Commerce and others have said is not happening. So we also see some of the typical mismatch in priorities, I think, between the two sides, wherein the Chinese are focused on getting the administration to agree to what they call sort of guiding principles for the relationship, while the U.S. side wants to leave that largely to the side and focus instead on specific areas where progress could actually be made. And so, this phenomenon, obviously, which I think is sometimes best captured in the Chinese aphorism, sleeping in the same bed and dreaming different dreams. I think it's fair to say that
I love the Chinese. I just absolutely love
my contacts on both sides say the problem's gotten much worse, right? Given the deep mutual suspicion on both sides, where even seemingly innocuous concepts such as describing the relationship as one of mutual respect, seem to be really controversial. And again, although that suspicion is mutual, my sense is that the U.S. insecurities, perhaps about its position in what it calls intense strategic competition with China, may be driving a lot of the discord on, those seemingly basic issues. So we've got those structural tensions still in place.
Yeah. So this is a great transition to, what I think is a kind of interesting question, which is, how would you characterize Beijing's objectives in its policy toward the U.S. and the U.S.'s objectives in its policy toward China, and is either side making any progress in those objectives?
Yeah, I think, that's another great question, and one that is difficult to answer, I think, for a number of reasons. I mean, the most obvious one that just comes to me off the top of my head is that both sides say, both to themselves and to the wider global constituencies they're probably both trying to court, that this competition will play out over at least the next 20, 30, or even 50 years. So one could say it's sort of unfair, right, to judge the effectiveness of the policies when we might say they're still in their relative infancy. So we could, I suppose, be guided by the, turns out, misquote attributed to then Premier Zhou Enlai in China when he was asked in 1972 about the impact of the French Revolution and replied, "It's too early to say." But, even granting those caveats, I do think it's fair to evaluate some aspects of the respective strategies, and that, even though we might be in their comparative early days, if either side is making fundamental strategic misjudgments, right, about the other or about their own approach, so the foundation of the strategy is off kilter, I guess we could say, then we can expect them to remain so going forward. So I guess if we were to look at it in something of a policy scorecard, it's my judgment that the two sides, they're roughly tied, I think, in terms of each party's strategy. And that is that, they have areas where they are being successful. I think places where they've erred pretty badly, and places where it truly is too early to say. And I think in terms of their respective successes, it seems to me that the U.S. has been quite effective in what I would call two of the three legs of a stool, that I think would make up a reasonable China strategy in the modern era, and those would be what the administration likes to call, sort of domestic strengthening at home. So this is things like the CHIPS Act, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so on. And I think they've been very effective when it comes to what they call coordinating with allies and partners, or shaping the strategic environment around China. You often hear the administration officials talk about that. And I think, just to give a quick few examples there, we have obviously the AUKUS arrangement between the US, the UK, and Australia, which is designed to grant Canberra access to US nuclear submarine technology. The strengthening of the Quad arrangement, which brings together the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And then a breakthrough, I think we can say, summit at Camp David in August, where Biden, brought his South Korean and Japanese counterparts together to focus on mutual strategic cooperation with China at the core, despite, longstanding historical tensions between those two leaderships, which are well familiar with. So, and I think, turning to the Chinese wins, I think it's fair to say Xi Jinping has been effective in conveying to President Biden that Taiwan is the one issue that could really tear the relationship asunder. And he's succeeded, I think, in getting Biden to dial back some of the more forward-leaning administration initiatives that we saw, a year or two ago on Taiwan, that the Chinese certainly saw as eroding what they see as the traditional one China policy that Washington committed to in the 70s. And that message has been conveyed, and it seems Biden has gotten the message. Note, for example, that the president has not made any comments recently around the U.S. willingness to defend Taiwan militarily, whereas there was a period there a couple of years ago where he seemed to be doing that all the time. I think also another headway area for the Chinese is their efforts to portray the geopolitical landscape is not just East versus West, but also in terms of North versus South, right? In their clear effort to court support from the global South countries in Africa and the Middle East and so on. And I think it's fair to say along those lines, the recent expansion of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to include several other countries, is emblematic. And then maybe turning to a couple of failures, I think the principal one for the U.S. is what should be the third leg of that stool that I described earlier for what ingredients make a more stable relationship, and that's talking to China, right? In my judgment, the administration erred badly in its roughly first 2.5 years in power by pursuing a strategy, what I call sort of strategic avoidance of China, right? Where the administration would claim that this was necessary, I guess, in order to build up the first two legs of the stool, that domestic strengthening and coordinating with allies, with the idea that only doing that first could allow the administration to engage China from what they like to call a position of strength. I think the problem with that strategy is that it allowed the mutual suspicions I just referred to fester, making the relationship inherently unstable. So, in my mind, the best reflection of that was the crisis that should have been a non-crisis around the Chinese spy balloon, right, that flew over U.S. territory earlier this year. The breakdown in traditional lanes of communication, including that longstanding intelligence channel that both you and I were well familiar with at various times, meant that what should have been a fairly minor dust-up probably escalated to the point where, both sides and I think especially third countries who have an interest thought the relationship was on the verge of disintegrating, right? And I think probably similarly, the sort of naive view from the administration that it could afford to just ignore a country of the size and scale and heft of China, that I think was a mistake. And a potential risk there is that, now the U.S. might find itself inclined to make more concessions to China to stabilize the bilateral relationship than it might otherwise have had to if it was just dealing with China all along. So I think that's important. And then turning, to some of the sort of Chinese elements there, it strikes me that the policy failures in their respect, the first, I think, is their misplaying, obviously, of consequential relationships with middle powers. And there, I think the best example is the relationship with Australia, right, where Beijing's efforts to punish them, primarily economically for Chinese would call it the audacity of the Australians to call for an international investigations on the origin of COVID, I think that failed miserably when Australia refused to ban. And although China would never say so publicly, several senior contacts I met when I was over, they kind of told me the leadership recognizes that the campaign was a failure. And we now see the Chinese having agreed to rescind all those economic blandishments. And there's going to be, well, actually, Prime Minister Albanese is there right now, on a visit. So that, I think, is one. And then the second fundamental failure of China's strategy, it seems to me, is the decision to start more directly retaliating, right, for the U.S. hostile acts in the economic and trade space. And I think it's fair to say China certainly has the right to do so, but the way they've done it, such as tightening access to vital economic data and raids of these U.S. consulting and due diligence firms, that's added to already substantial foreign investor, I guess we call it scar tissue, resulting from 3 years of zero COVID and so on. So that's a big problem as well. And the lack of transparency around it has been the fundamental problem. And then just quickly on a couple of areas where it might be too early to judge, it seems to me the obvious one for the U.S. is the sweeping technology restrictions, right, around semiconductors in particular. One thing that has struck me there is kind of how the administration can say with a straight face that it's pursuing this, sort of small yard, high fence approach when it comes to technology, when in fact the controls put in place on chips, in particular, it seems to me, basically seek to deny China access to not just particular high-end chips, but to the entire ecosystem, right, of items necessary to produce chips themselves, tool-making equipment, precursor chemicals, and so on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we had the rollout by Huawei of their new smartphone, right, allegedly powered by a 7-nanometer chip, while Secretary Raimondo was visiting China, and the sort of online trolling of the secretary that accompanied that. And that has touched off, I think, a huge debate in Washington over whether those developments give the lie to the U.S. policy approach on limiting access to these chips, or perhaps whether the USG simply hasn't gone far enough, right, in terms of seeking to limit access. And so I think that's one where we are obviously still seeing how this is all going to play out. And I think for the Chinese, I think the best example for them in this category is, kind of Xi Jinping's clear effort since the Party Congress last year, that handed him this unprecedented third term in power to adopt, I guess, what we might call sort of a fortress economy approach to safeguarding China's ability to develop its economy. Most economists, I think it's fair to say, seem to judge that policy as doomed to failure, but my sense is it's too early to determine whether the pain the economy is facing now will be enduring, or whether that emphasis on sort of self-reliance actually makes sense in the longer term, given the sort of geopolitical and other pressures buffeting China. So I think we'll have to see on that one.
Chris, that's fantastic. Let's shift gears to politics. I'm wondering if you can address the death of former Premier Li at only 68 and the outpouring of really what seemed to be genuine condolences and sympathy for him, despite the official censor's effort to prevent it.
Yeah. No, I think fundamentally, obviously it came as a shock. I think what's interesting is that how someone like Premier Li, who really did not have the most influence, I mean, I think he arguably was the weakest premier in the history of the People's Republic of China. She fenced him in, pretty early in their respective tenures and slowly usurped power away from him over time, especially when it comes to managing the economy, with things like, creating these parallel party structures that took a lot of the decision making that used to happen over in the government side, the state council, which would have been under Premier Li's purview, and bringing it over to the party side, and just in general treating him almost like a non-entity. So in other words, it was not like the former Premier Zhu Rongji or even former Premier Wen Jiabao, right, who had a fair amount of influence. So then you sort of say, okay, so this guy was kind of a dud. So why was there this public outpouring of feeling? And you get the sense it is a certain yearning, right, for a previous era where the leadership was more collective. It was interesting, the different ways in which I was there, while all this was happening. And it was interesting to me to watch the different ways in which the sentiment was being portrayed. And a lot of it had to do with photos of Li Keqiang with individual people, right? There were remarks around the fact that he grew up in poverty, whereas, of course, Xi Jinping grew up in an elite family and so on. And so he kind of better understood the concerns and the travails of average Chinese. And so it's more of a commentary, I think, in some way, right, about how people feel about the current ecosystem, if you will, that Xi Jinping has put together, rather than any particular outpouring for Li. I mean, I think what's worth saying is that while the regime clearly, I could see it, very visibly. He died, I think, as I was flying over to China, and the first day I was there, things looked kind of normal, but the next day there was a much heavier police and security presence, in the subways and all over the city in Beijing. So clearly they were concerned about the potential for unrest, and some people sort of thought, well, this could be like, the outpouring we saw for the former general secretary of the party, Hu Yaobang, when he died in 1989, also of a heart attack, which led to the Tiananmen situation. My view was that was unlikely for what I said earlier. Hu Yaobang made a major impact at that time. People really felt for him, and it was a different era, right, in terms of how people express themselves in China. So, I think the leadership's largely kept a lid on it. And then one thing they've done smartly is, they have a playbook, right, when these deaths occur. They have a very rigid, series of procedures they follow. So they have duplicated 100% in terms of the funeral and the cremation and the biography, the official biography and all that, exactly how another former premier, Li Peng, who actually was kind of the orchestrator, or at least the administrator of the Tiananmen crackdown, when he died in 2019. I mean, even in People's Daily, the position of the photo, the material running down the side of the page, where all of that stuff has been exactly duplicated, I think in part, so no one can suggest she was somehow snubbing Li Keqiang. And in fact, that was interesting. At the funeral, Xi Jinping's wife went with him, right? And that's very unusual in these official funerals. So I think that was meant to convey a certain personal touch, right? To show I did respect this person and so on.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Chris Johnson. One of the things we do in the podcast world is cross-promote. My good friend, Sandy Winnefeld, who has been a guest and a guest host on Intelligence Matters, and who actually came up with the name Intelligence Matters, has his own podcast that he's put together with retired astronaut Sandra Magnus. It's called The Adrenaline Zone, and it's about people who take risk, all kinds of risk, and it's really good. They just put up their 41st episode with the best ever hockey goalie, Martin Brodeur. Check out The Adrenaline Zone on their website or wherever you get your podcasts. So over the last several months, we've had the disappearance of the foreign minister, the defense minister, the ultimate firing of the defense minister, along with several other senior military officials. What's going on there? Is it all related to corruption?
Yeah, well, I think, we need to start probably by acknowledging that, as we were just sort of discussing a little bit about, the vagaries of politics in China these days, there's been little official information to go on, right, when it comes to these couple of cases. And arguably, they've remained more tight-lipped, maybe, than they have compared to previous comparable cases. Although, when these big fish fall, there's usually some kind of an interval between the, hey, they're out of their job, and the listing of the wrongdoings, that inevitably comes later. But this has launched, I think, a boundless speculation, therefore, about, what may have happened. I think with the foreign minister, Qin Gang, some rumors had suggested he was directly or indirectly providing sensitive information to foreign intelligence services, right? So, really salacious stuff. But I think, as one of my early managers and mentors at CIA used to like to tell me, Chris, sometimes a banana is just a banana, right? In other words,
Occam's razor.
I think in Qin's case in particular, the public narrative that we've seen is pretty accurate. He was ensnared by an extramarital liaison that went bad, that led, to his ouster. And it's my sense that the official rendering, therefore is they took pains, right, in their sort of official description to delineate that his failings were personal, right, and not political. In other words, he made a moral mistake, but he was not, working for a foreign government or something along those lines. And so my instinct is that although Qin himself may not have made such mistakes, maybe the regime's strong reaction seems a bit too harsh, for just a simple dalliance, but we'll have to await, I think, more authoritative information to know what's happening there. And in the case of the defense minister, here again, the popular narrative, I think, is around garden variety corruption, I guess we'd call it, related to these defense contracts, during his tenure as head of the PLA's, the Chinese military's procurement body. And that would seem to make some sense. Of course, there's always opportunities and when there's a lot of cash, sloshing around, as would the removals of both the commander and the political overseer, I guess you could say, of the PLA's missile force that you referred to. It's always been my view that if you want to know where the corruption is likely to be within the PLA at any given moment, just look at what they're building, where they're building the most. And so that was true in the Navy, for example, about a decade or more ago. And as DOD's recent China military report recently underscored, obviously the PLA is on sort of a crash build out of its nuclear force, right? Meaning there's a lot of silo and other construction, going on. So, it's still my sense, though, I think that we might learn in the end that the actual source of this corruption may have had less to do with the ousted generals themselves and perhaps more to do with longstanding issues around the failure of officials to control their family members and their children. But, as with Chin's case, I think we'll simply have to wait for the word from the regime to get a better feel for that.
Yeah, and if it is corruption, right? I mean, she took on military corruption.
Yes.
When he first came to power, and then we haven't heard much. So if it is corruption, it's sort of either always been there, right, or it's crept back. And any sense, if that's the case, why she had to act now, rather than wait, right? Why now, I guess, is the question.
Well, in particular, because, at least in the case of these generals, well, also Qin Gang, the foreign minister, they just were put in office, like in March. And so, or in the case of the rocket forces generals earlier, but these people were all freshly minted or relatively freshly minted. They were handpicked, at least the official media would have us believe that, by Xi Jinping, right? And so what does that say about the vetting process, for these guys? So that's important, and it speaks to your question about the persistence of it. My feeling is it should surprise no one, I guess, that it remains something of a problem. As I just mentioned, there's a lot of money sloshing around inside the PLA, and so there's a lot of temptation. There also is something, I think, of a lack of transparency, obviously, in PLA budgeting and so forth that makes it easier for this kind of graft to happen. That said, I have been surprised, I have to say, by what I consider to be some outdated analyses around these recent cases, sort of suggesting that perhaps Xi's effort to bring the PLA more firmly under his personal grip had failed, or that the PLA remains the largely autonomous fiefdom it had been under Xi's two immediate predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. I find both of those suggestions really to be ignorant of not just the reality of the situation, but in contravention of what we might call sort of positive observable fact. In my mind, you don't need non-public insight to understand that Xi has had major successes in bringing the PLA more under the party's and his personal direct control. So in my mind, like, for example, the fact that the corruption still exists does not necessarily mean the approach has failed. The reality is that the high command is much more focused now, I think, on its two primary missions, I guess we could say in order of importance, of keeping the regime in power and defending the country, right, from China's foreign adversaries. This is very different, I think, from when Xi first took power, and even when he was still leader in waiting, at that time, and sort of looking at things like the Egyptian military's abandonment of Mubarak, during the Arab Spring. My sense was that Xi had real doubts about whether the PLA would be willing to save the regime, if called upon, as it was during the 89 Tiananmen crisis. Cleaning up a lot of the corruption there presumably has, I think, improved his confidence in that respect, as have organizational changes, right, such as bringing the regime's paramilitary sort of anti-riot forces directly under the control of the party's Central Military Commission, and therefore him, to better sort of optimize coordination of the various elements of the regime's coercive toolkit in a crisis. But I think, Xi's greatest achievement clearly has been pushing through this very disruptive retooling of the PLA's command system, the weaknesses of wherein, they disposed, right, of the Soviet General Staff command system, the weaknesses of which I think we have seen on display, right, in Russia's fledgling war in Ukraine, and in favor of a system more closely mirroring U.S. combatant commands. Although that's still very much a work in progress, I think the main point is that several of Xi's predecessors, including Deng Xiaoping himself, right, attempted some version of that force restructuring and were unable to pull it off due to the political power of the PLA. I think Xi's anti-corruption efforts certainly started the process of breaking down those personal and institutional networks within the PLA that then cleared the way for him to ram through this force restructuring, which I think has further atomized the formation of these cliques, right, within the military. So I guess the bottom line in my mind is let's be sure to give the man the credit he's due.
Yeah. So he's still in control, but I wonder what the corruption says, right, about the PLA's military capabilities, right, if they were ever called on to fight. The fact that these guys are corrupt, some of them bought their positions, what does that say about how confident he can be in them?
Yeah.
when he ultimately needs them.
Well, I think that may be good news for all of us, right, who are concerned about a possible Taiwan scenario, and that,
Yeah.
learning that the head of your, or at least perhaps the relatives of your, the former head of your procurement enterprise for the last half decade is corrupt, that the head and the commander and political commissar of your rocket forces, which are, instrumental in any type of Taiwan invasion scenario, may have been unreliable. This is a huge shock, right, for Xi, I think. And yet, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of pay for promotion or the buying of military rank. This is something that I
Yeah.
think has also been absent in the recent analyses of these latest developments. That was a problem, before Xi arrived. And in fact, I think that was his main preoccupation, because what we had at that time was two then vice chairmen, the two top uniformed officers in China, Guo Boxiong and Xu Taiho, who had been actively engaging in that practice. And I think, aside from the concerns about military performance and loyalty, I guess you can say, the bigger concern for them, remember, the PLA is not the national military of China. It's the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, right, whose main job, as I just mentioned a minute ago, is keeping the
Yeah.
regime in power. This meant that these guys were building an army, right, within the party's army. That is not something you can tolerate if you're general secretary. There's no indication in these latest cases that anything like pay for promotion was going on. Instead, what we see is what we might call sort of garden variety corruption. It's not good, it's corrosive, and so on and so forth. But it's not the level of danger in the way they view their system that pay for promotion stuff has been. And I think that's been seriously tamped down, if not eliminated.
So Chris, you said it's too early to tell whether China's economic problems, right, are short term or longer term.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I did want to ask about Evan Osnos's recent piece in the New Yorker. As you know, Evan is a China watcher, a very
he
good
is.
one, I think.
And a close personal
And he
friend.
just wrote a piece. Yeah, he just wrote a piece that talks about what he sees as a national malaise in China. And you just got back. What's your sense?
No, I agree. I think that there's some truth in that. You do get the sense that the place is sort of burdened, or there's this strong sense of ennui. I think Evan would acknowledge one of the challenges with that is, who you interview, sort of makes some sense. And if you look at the type of folks that he was engaging with, and he, in my mind, he managed, or he tried hard to put those caveats into the piece. You're talking to people who are relatively at an elite level, right? So people who've gone to university, who are struggling to find jobs, investors, right, of various kinds, private sector investors, and they have a lot of reason, right, to be gloomy, or at least unsure, about the future. One thing that was just observationally interesting to me during my trip, I had some unusual amount of spare time on one day, and just went out kind of to walk around the city, because I haven't really done that since COVID ended. And you see young people riding the subway, interacting with each other as young people here in the U.S. would, and it doesn't mean they're not worried about their job prospects and so on. I just wonder sometimes if this is this whole idea of everybody's miserable is a little overwrought. I think the other thing that I hear consistently from contacts who are sort of close to Xi Jinping is that he focuses more on how, what they call the Laobaixing, the common Chinese people, how they're thinking about his leadership, and they love him. I mean, one never wants to put too much emphasis on taxi driver intelligence or something like that. But when you talk to those kind of folks, they'll say, yeah, times are tough, and I wish the economy were doing better, but she's doing the right thing, for the country. So it's this weird amalgamum, and I think it's very easy for folks to get into these, comparisons to Brezhnevian sclerosis in the Soviet Union and so on, when I think we're probably still a decent ways from that.
Yeah, people like to hope, right? And
Yes, exactly.
they love to see in other countries what they want to see, right?
And I think I'm glad you raised that, is that there's can be some cognitive dissonance, I think, at times, where, because the regime has not gone in a direction that many media or analysts, commentators had hoped, in terms of what we saw to be a fairly stable collective leadership that was following some notional norms and looking fairly institutional over the course of 2.5, 3 decades following Deng Xiaoping and his death and so on, and then to see it revert to sort of a more Mao looking, or at least one man rule looking enterprise. I think that has left a lot of people disappointed, and therefore maybe colors their view of the system. I don't think Evan suffers from that problem at all, but I think that is an issue in the China watching community.
Chris, we have a few minutes left here, so maybe we can turn to some more current events and give us China's thinking about its current policy approach, both to the war in Ukraine and to the crisis in the Middle East.
Sure. Well, I think their policy approaches to both those crises are somewhat intertwined in terms of the Politburo's sort of macro objectives, I guess we could call them. And they certainly seem to be working off the same playbook, it seems to me, on both those crises, which is to sort of proclaim strict neutrality publicly, right? While they are said to be, having sort of 90, but yet having maybe 90 to 95% of their metaphorical body on on one side of the fence that they are supposedly straddling, right? So near total support, for example, for Russia in its war with Ukraine, and a pretty firm stance supporting the Palestinian side, right, in the Israel-Hamas conflict, up to and including, steadfastly refusing to condemn Hamas's attack on October 7th, which I think certainly Israel sees as pretty egregious. I think with Russia, it's clear that the Chinese, although ultimately wanting to see the conflict end with Ukraine, they're satisfied for now, I guess, with the war edging more toward a stalemate, going into the winter, or at least the possible collapse of Putin and his regime that they had been fearing seems less likely for the foreseeable future. I think they've maintained their position on telling Putin, no use of nuclear weapons, right, and on largely avoiding straying across the West's, red line in terms of providing weapons or other material support to the Russian war effort. But the Chinese continue obviously to bolster Putin's regimes in a way that they can, especially in economic cooperation and so on. On Israel Hamas, I mean, it has been striking to me, as I said a moment ago, that the Chinese have been willing to risk what seemed like a fairly robust links that they have with Israel on certain forms of economic and maybe even especially technological cooperation by refusing, to condemn Hamas. And of interest, it's my understanding, from folks I spoke to, that one of the reasons there is that Prime Minister Netanyahu some time ago, and under some pressure, at least from the Chinese view, from the U.S., made some comments about, sort of space for Taiwan internationally or something. And, President Xi's reaction was that was totally out of bounds and sort of a betrayal. And so, and I also think, the Chinese have some qualms about the U.S.-led moves to secure peace agreements, right, between Israel and many of the Arab neighbors, which in my mind is interesting, and that it, hints perhaps at a broader ambition that the Chinese may have for what type of influence they want to ultimately wield in the region, which also, might help explain their behavior there. So, and then I just think we have to talk about the critical issue of Iran, right? And it's my sense the Chinese are trying their best, I think, to sit on Tehran and keep them out of the fight. I found it interesting. There's a sense in China, anyway, that Iran believes Hamas may have, I guess you'd call it, exceeded their brief, right, in terms of the scope or maybe the surprising success of the attack on Israel. And so, the mullahs are now trying to rein in their proxy. So, the Chinese are trying to give them some room. I think there's also the issue that Chinese are becoming more eager for direct engagements in Iran than they have been previously. People forget that back in the, I guess it would be in the sort of early 2000s period when Ahmadinejad visited China, he didn't meet with the top leader, Hu Jintao, at the time. He was given a pretty low reception. I mean, that has definitely changed under Xi, but I think also, at the end of the day, right, the Chinese have 100% leverage over Iran, given how much of their oil they consume. But I think it's fair to say so far they've shown themselves to be 100% unwilling to use that leverage, kind of similar
Sounds
to
like North Korea.
Well, and Russia, right? Say exactly the same sort of policy playbook.
Yeah.
So it's my sense too, and I think this is an important point to end on this section on, is that, the Chinese as good Marxists, after all, right? They're very realistic about their ability to constrain what they see at the end of the day as a very fanatical religious regime. That reality, it's not noted in the public discourse very much today. I think it remains a fundamental constraint on their ability to, deepen ties there.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, Chris, that the U.S. had been, quite successful in strengthening its relationships with countries, right, that matter to China. And I'm just wondering how China is thinking about and reacting, right, to our increasingly close ties with countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan. What do you think their take on that is, and how do you think they're thinking about reacting?
Well, they're definitely concerned about it. There's no question. I think, unfortunately, right, this then does play into this to some degree, into the dialectical thinking, right, that does sort of govern their approach to a lot of their foreign relationships, in the sense that, they have a strong view, basically, that the orientation of the geopolitical landscape is, look, the U.S. is out to get us, right, and at least wants to counter our rise, or maybe even wants to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. Therefore, they're kind of our implacable enemy. Therefore, Russia is our natural partner, right? And trying to push back that. Yeah. And everybody else, in, Europe, Asia, et cetera, is kind of quote unquote in play, right? And so they're not surprised, I think, when they see the dastardly U.S., trying to increase its linkages to these countries. I mean, what's surprising to me, and I think to a lot of analysts, is sometimes how little the Chinese are willing to concede, or understand, maybe is a better term, their own role, right, in moving those governments in that direction. And then kind of what I mentioned just now with Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments, I think it is emblematic as well that inside the system these days, when Xi Jinping sets out a course, on a particular country or policy or issue, it's very hard for people inside the system to suggest, alternative approaches. So take, for example, the situation with the Philippines right now, which is, I think, an important flashpoint over the South China Sea, rival claims, right. Second Thomas Shoal and so on. My understanding is that, she got embarrassed, basically. They invited Marcos Jr. to come to Beijing in January, I think it was. They rolled out all the red carpets and handed out a lot of goodies in terms of investment and deals and so on. And then the next month he's in Japan, right, strengthening defense relations with Japan. Then he comes to the U.S. and offers up 4 new military bases. In other words, President Xi's kind of view is, I got burnt, by Marcos. Yeah. So the response then is no quarter, for the Filipinos. And so then that leaves the system pretty shackled, right, in terms of their ability to respond. And I think South Korea, I would say, is a different animal. It's been very interesting in my mind there to see how, despite pretty heavy U.S. and allied pressure to get them to kind of come more on board with the technology, the semiconductor restrictions, they've been pretty reticent there. And I think, a big reason for that might be what you just alluded to, which is the Chinese can always say, hey, we can dial up or dial down Mr. Tim, as we want and need to. So bear that in mind, in terms of how you react to that U.S. pressure. So, the playing field, I think, is evolving in a direction, but is also complicated. The Vietnamese as well, you mentioned them. Yes, a lot of, companies are, my understanding from a business person, for example, when I was in China, every bar, every hotel in Hanoi right now is ran because people are moving supply chains. And yet a lot of the companies that are moving those supply chains are actually Chinese, suppliers, so that they can get a stamped made in Vietnam, on their product, as opposed to made in China, and therefore evade tariffs and so on.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'll have to have you back soon, because there's a lot of questions that I didn't get to that I wanted to ask you. But as always, great to have you. Amazing insights. Look forward to next time.
Sounds great, Michael. Thank you.
That was Chris Johnson. I'm Michael Morell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.